Hello and welcome to Seeking the Truth. I'm Kaveh Taghwayi. In January of this year, Iran's leader wrote a two-page, 900-worded letter addressed to the youth in Europe and North America due to the demonization of Islam. The goal of the letter was to convince youth to get first-hand knowledge of the religion using the Quran and the life of its great prophet, which is what we'll be doing for the next hour with our panel of guests and studio audience. But first, from London, Nargis Moballaghi covers the subject.
It is an unprecedented open letter, and although the Western media have picked up on it, Ayatollah Khamenei deliberately bypassed them to write it. In the two-page letter, Ayatollah Khamenei says recent events in France and elsewhere convinced him to talk directly to young people, and not just about these events, but to make an appeal that they look into why Islam is being demonized and then look past that demonization to get first-hand knowledge of the religion.
The letter is very important at this juncture of time because Islam is now being attacked from two different fronts. One is by the perfect action of certain people who do what they do in the name of Islam. And the other, which is as important, is that these actions give fodder to certain right-wing, extreme right-wing people in the West to attack Islam. What Ayatollah Khamenei is trying to pass as the message is that we have to look beyond what we see in the media, beyond what the politicians say. This is the important message.
So, have young people in Britain started to see beyond the rhetoric? We asked 18-year-old student Izzy what she thinks of Islam.
I think it has a lot of really interesting beliefs, and it's actually a really beautiful religion, but because of some of the minority, a lot of people have a negative view, but I think that's very out of date, and I think people should kind of see it for the beauty that it is.
We asked Izzy to read Ayatollah Khamenei's letter.
That's a good letter, basically. I think that if that message spread, then that would be a lot easier for people to understand. I think that's definitely, it's a good way of putting it.
In today's storm of misinformation, it is a message not often heard. Nargis Moballaghi, Press TV, London.
Let's try to see if we can get that message heard through our format here. If you're just joining us, this is a conference for the next hour. It's called Seeking the Truth. Joining us in the studios, we have some youths, as Iran's leader made that address through his letter. And also, we have in our panel Dr. Mohammad Marandi. He's a professor at the University of Tehran. I'd like to welcome you all to Seeking the Truth. And we also have guests joining us from two different guests that we have. Abdul Ali Musa, who's the director of the Imam Masjid, who joins us from Washington. And also we have Kevin Barrett. He's the author and Islamic studies expert who joins us in order to get a more insightful impression of what Iran's leader meant through this letter. Well, let me start with you, Dr. Marandi. Let's first ask a very general question as to why Iran's leader went into writing and addressing this subject through the format that he chose, which was a letter. What was your impression?
I think the recent events that have taken place in the region, especially in the last few years, as well as the rise of Islamophobic tendencies in Europe, and even in Iranophobic tendencies as well, but mainly Islamophobic tendencies. I think he probably felt that this is a very good opportunity to respond to many of the questions that have been raised in the West, because unfortunately with the rise of groups like Daesh or ISIL or IS and other such extremist organizations like the Nusra Front and others, the Western media has effectively portrayed Islam as being an extreme ideology, a violent ideology. Whereas in reality, if one looks at recent history, the ideology behind these extremist movements has been Wahhabism, which comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, which is promoted by countries like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. They heavily fund this ideology, and they've been doing it for decades with Western support. And unfortunately, in Libya and subsequently Syria, They also used militants to overthrow the Libyan regime, and basically we have a destroyed country now as a result of NATO actions in that country and civil war. And they attempted to do the same in Syria, which led to great devastation. So ironically, while Islam has been effectively equated with these extremist ideologies, if one looks at it more carefully, at the situation, one sees that basically Western countries have had a major role to play in this extremism. And I think Ayatollah Khamenei also alludes to this to a degree in the letter when he speaks about many historians who've courageously revisited the past and have pointed out the many problems that have been brought about in the world as a result of the actions of Western country in the past, but how historians and many thinkers refrain from dealing with the present as they do with the past. And I think that's to a large degree true with what's going on in the region. The true story of the rise of Wahhabism in recent decades with American and European support, and the rise of extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and more recently Al-Qaeda and ISIL in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Yemen and so on and so forth, and in countries like Nigeria. This reality has not been explained adequately to a Western audience. So instead of blaming Muslims, basically I think the idea is that thinkers and the youth should be looking to Western policymakers for a lot of what is going on, as well as their regional allies.
Of course, the demonization goes much deeper in terms of the way that it's exercised. We're going to get to those points shortly, but I'd like to share with our audience and the viewers at home. First of all, we have an email. Please do send us your comments, questions. It's conference@presstv.com. We'd really like to hear from you. This conference, even though it's just 1 hour in length, we're going to try to get to all points as it's been pointed out through a number of emails that you have sent us. And I'd like to go to you, Kevin Barrett, and ask you, one of the emails that was discussed is much of the media seems like they're promoting Islam through Daesh. And again, this is based on some of the responses and questions that have been raised from the viewers in terms of how they wrote it in. And this particular viewer said, why is it that you are saying that what the Islam that Daesh is promoting is different from real Islam? What is your response to that?
Well, I think the Supreme Leader said it beautifully when he said, don't allow them, meaning the Western promoters of Islamophobia, to introduce their own recruited terrorists as representatives of Islam. And he was talking about not only Daesh and Al-Qaeda and some of these extremist Wahhabi tendencies that have been used by the West in their imperial adventures, but also, I believe, of the false flag terror attacks that have been plaguing the world. And I think that one of the reasons that he released this letter at this juncture is that we've just seen a wave of false flag attacks attributed to radical Muslims supposedly associated with ISIS, but actually performed by members of the Western security services themselves. We saw such attacks in Ottawa, Canada. We saw them in Sydney, Australia, then in Paris, France, and on to Copenhagen. That was, of course, the Copenhagen attack came after the letter was released. The letter was released in response to the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris. In all of those cases, it appears that patsies, that is, Muslim either extremists or informants, were recruited by the intelligence services, which then carried out the acts in order to blame Islam. And this has been going on since 9/11, which was the public relations event that launched the war on Islam. But in order to keep this clash of civilizations going and keep Islam as the next civilizational enemy, as the Supreme Leader said in his letter, that this has been the plan ever since the communist enemy disappeared at the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they have to keep creating the impression that there is a threat from radical Islam. And these spectacular events, whether they are actual atrocities committed by Daesh or Al-Qaeda or whichever extremists may actually be committing some atrocities, or whether they are false flag stunts staged by Western and especially Israeli intelligence services, in either case, this is seized upon by the media, which is always looking for something exciting and bloody and eye-catching, and including the social media, which is a good place for these beheading videos and atrocity images that people can't seem to take their eyes away from. And all of this means that the association of the religion of Islam with all of this horrific violence creates a kind of an emotional impression in the audience. And that's precisely the kind of brainwashing process that the Supreme Leader's letter was meant to counter. And I'll tell you, this is long overdue. Every Muslim leader, every Muslim political leader in particular, should have been saying exactly this over the past 15 years since 9/11. It's been absolutely clear what the plan was, how they were using this synthetic terrorism, as historian Webster Tarpley puts it, to smear the image of Islam, create a civilizational enemy, justify military-industrial complex profits and imperial adventures and Zionist expansion. So I think the best way to counter this, of course, is through education and the spread of knowledge, especially to younger people who are curious and more open-minded and who represent the next generation. And so I think the Supreme Leader made a very good move by writing this eloquent letter and sending it directly to the young people rather than through the usual politicians.
Okay, let's try to get an explanation from you, Abdul Ali Musa, about how Daesh has been presented through, again, some of the questions that have been raised for this hour by some of the viewers. And it's interesting looking at this, and again, these are the viewers who have made the statements, and I'd like to read off another one of these questions. And it says, how it is that Iran's leader wants the youth to have Islam not be interpreted through how Daesh is presenting it. Isn't Daesh supposed to represent Islam? Obviously, this really portrays the disconnect that the youth maybe have, or people in general have, towards Islam, Daesh, and their actions. Because we know that Daesh obviously has been a magnet in some respects, pulling in lots of people towards, well, if you want to call it, their ideologies.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We would like to thank the previous speakers, Dr. Morandi and Dr. Bennett. We concur 100% with their analysis. The way we reacted to the letter of the Rahbar here in the U.S. was, it relates to us like a call to arms. It tells us, don't blame the Saudis for being Saudis, don't blame Zionists for being Zionists, and don't blame Americans for acting like Zionists and Americans. What it is a call to psychological and spiritual arms, and that we have to rise to the occasion to present our own picture of our own reality. In other words, we don't necessarily have to blame the media, because they're doing the job that they was designed to do, to make war profits, to cause fitna globally. But what it is for us is that we have to develop the means in media and every other way, right, to paint our own picture of our own reality. In other words, perception management is what the Rahbar was speaking about, that they draw a picture or an image of Muslims and of Islam, and the people act off of the perception, not the reality. Therefore, we have to design our own image for the public. I'll give you one example. Once I was in Iran, and I think that was a movie about 1,000 Jewish people that were rescued and brought to Iran during World War II. Okay, we know about Schindler's List and every one person that rescued one Jew anywhere in the world. But we have no idea here in the West that Iran has played a major part in protecting the lives and rescuing Jews. All they tell you about is that Iran is against Judaism, it's against Jewish people, but yet there have been people, Jewish people in Iran, since the history books say 589 BC, and they're still there. If they were being oppressed, right, then they would have left thousands of years ago. This is a story. What I mean is we have to present our story. We have the greatest story ever told. A revolution that happens by the people, the wonderful leadership of Imam Khomeini, the structure of the Constitution, right? Not a dictatorship. The leadership of the Rahbar, the Majlis, and the Majlis Obregon. We have institutions that are world-inspiring. We believe we just have to tell that message ourselves.
Okay. Dr. Morandi, there's one thing that comes to mind when we're listening to our guest, Abdullah Ali Musa there. And that is the fact that it's something that's been promoted by the West, and it's pretty obvious. And this idea of sectarianism and basically pitting, I should say, one sect against the other. It, in a sense, promotes the idea that one is better than the other, whether it's religion, whether it's ideas, or what have you. But that is not what Iran's leader is saying. Because, again, looking at some of the questions that viewers have posed through the net, one of the things is why hasn't Iran's leader spoken of or said things against, for example, Judaism or Christianity? One of the questions, again, that's been posed. Why has that not been the case?
Well, I think it would be surprising if he did critique them. One of the things that we regularly see in the Western media is how Iran is opposed to Jews, as your guest rightly pointed out, but they failed to mention that Jews in Iran, according to the Iranian constitution, have to have at least one MP in parliament. Even if there's, theoretically speaking, only one Jew in the country. We have a significant, healthy number of Jews in Iran, but even if there was only one Jew in the country, that individual would have to become an MP in parliament, because that's what the Constitution says. And the same is true for Christians as well. So unlike in Western countries where, for example, in France you have a very large Muslim minority, yet the Constitution does not acknowledge that, or at least the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that Muslims must be represented in parliament. In Iran we do have representation of these minorities. So it's obvious that the notion is not to critique any belief, any religion, any sect. The idea is that he's promoting is that Western governments and Western institutions of power, because of their hegemonic aspirations, they are basically demonizing other peoples in order to justify their policies. And they too are, in fact, the powers that to a large extent are behind the divisions. The sort of divide and rule policy that we've always heard of in the past is what the United States pursued in Iraq when it invaded the country. Iraq was a country where the Kurds, the Arabs, the Shias, the Sunnis, the Christians had been living side by side for thousands of years. And of course, after Islam, over 1,000 years, Muslims and non-Muslims. But the United States succeeded because of its own short-term policies in pitting one group against another. In Afghanistan and in Pakistan, the United States during the 1980s it supported the Saudi madrasas that were created throughout the country of Pakistan. Pakistan was a conservative country in the 1970s. It was a religious country, but people lived side by side in peace. only after Wahhabism was introduced into Pakistan did we see the rise of extremism in the country, where we regularly hear of people being slaughtered in mosques, on the streets, by bomb attacks, suicide attacks. This is a recent phenomenon. It's been as a result of partially, as I said, hegemonic ambitions, and the fact that the United States has allowed its extremist allies to promote these ideologies. And another reason is because of the rise of this, the one cause behind the rise of extremism is American support and Western support for dictatorships and the Zionist regime, the Israeli regime. Because Zionism itself is like ISIL. It believes in hierarchy of human beings. Certain human beings have an essential superiority to others, and this has caused great hardship and pain in this region. And when some young people who do not find a solution and do not see their countries as overcoming this huge injustice, if there is an extremist ideology, they may tend to move in that direction. So to a degree, one reason behind the rise of these extremist ideologies and organizations is actually American policy in the region, Western policy, by supporting apartheid, by supporting Western-oriented dictatorships. And I'm not saying that it's only the West that's to blame or the Saudis that are to blame, but in my opinion, there's no doubt that the overwhelming majority of those who are behind this problem reside in the United States and in countries like Saudi Arabia and throughout Europe.
Of course, they're each other's allies. One supports the other, so to speak. Again, I'd like to remind the viewers, conference@presstv.com. That's our address if you want to send any comments, questions. Please do so. As promised, we are going to discuss this also with the youths. We have youths inside our studio. We're going to get to you in a moment. But first, let's go to London and find out from the youths there if they have any questions for some of our guests. And I'm going to pass it on. I can see you guys there. Do you have any questions? Feel free to ask our panel. There's 3 guests that we have inside the studio. We have Dr. Marandi, and of course, Abdul Ali Musa, and Kevin Barrett is also with us. First, we have to go to London, and then I'll get to you guys. Just be patient with us on that. Okay, so go ahead. Any questions that anybody has from London? Go ahead.
Any questions that anybody has from London? Go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The first question I was going to ask you is, where do you see the current events going within the next 10 years if they carry on going at the same speed?
And when you say current events, you mean?
I mean in terms of the Islamophobia that's happening here in the West and also in the Middle East and in terms of the extremism.
Okay, Dr. Barrett, you go ahead with that one. Kevin Barrett? Okay, let's go to Abdul Ali Musa. If you had that question, go ahead with an answer. And if not, yeah, that's okay. We're going to get them in a minute. Why don't you go ahead, Dr. Marandi?
It's very difficult to say what's going to happen 10 years from now, because it's very difficult often to gauge what's going to happen in the next few weeks. But so I'll be very careful not to make any huge predictions. But I think it largely depends on Western governments and how they conduct themselves. And I think this is becoming a major threat to their own security, because on the one hand, it is without a doubt that the West is in relative decline, and that the economic situation, for example, in Europe, North America as well, the middle class is collapsing. This is something that they themselves acknowledge. But in Western Europe and in Europe, there's the economic situation is on the decline, and people, as we see in Greece and in Cyprus, in Italy, in Spain, Portugal, and to a degree in France, we see life is becoming more difficult. And as a result, extremist groups are on the rise, especially right-wing, semi-fascist, fascist organizations. And I find this to be very dangerous, because on the one hand, if the United States and its European partners continue to allow extremist organizations like Daesh, like Jabhat al-Nusra, and the ideology behind it, like the Wahhabism that Saudi Arabia promotes, if they allow this to continue to grow, this is going to create, it's going to be a very serious situation where you have, for example, right-wing groups in countries like France, and then you have militant Daesh-like or Wahhabi-like organizations in the same cities, in the same country. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, I got to jump in here real quick and ask you this, because I think this is a point that needs to, if you can, elaborate more on. Because again, relating to the letter being addressed to the youth, the term youth, for me anyways, means a time where there's a transition. Thoughts are being nourished, are being developed. And if Europe, or economically speaking, if Europe, and we can also say the United States in some respects, if they're economically on the decline, then that means that, youth are more susceptible, especially if they're unemployed.
That's right.
For them to be taken advantage of, which is why I think that that's been one of the success factors for these Daesh terrorists, taking advantage of that situation. I think that's maybe part of what you were.
Yes, exactly.
Part of what you were saying.
Right. And also right-wing fascist, semi-fascist organizations. Remember, one of the bloodiest attack in Europe was actually carried out by a Christian Zionists, killing, I think, 68, 78 people in Europe. So, which was quite recent. So it's not simply Daesh or Wahhabi extremism. It's extremism of all sorts. And the real danger is when young people who do not have jobs or who are susceptible to propaganda, and the media outlets constantly demonizing Muslims, and other outlets constantly demonizing those who are not Wahhabi, this otherization on all sides. This is a extremely dangerous. This can create a very dangerous situation. I think it already is. But again, I think one has to take into account that while some may say why blame Western countries, but the fact is that, for example, what we now see in this region, regardless of the fact that countries like Saudi Arabia have been investing, and other oil-rich Arab dictatorships have been investing in Wahhabism for quite a long time, for decades now, in Afghanistan and so on. But in recent years, what we saw in Libya was that NATO cooperated with Al-Qaeda. This is something that people in the West don't know. Many people, at least, many young people, that people like, and this is in the media, this is out there for people to see, people like Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who was a senior Al-Qaeda figure. NATO cooperated with him through the Qataris and other Arab regimes, and he helped to overthrow Gaddafi. He then went to a NATO country, Turkey, to Istanbul, and he led and he gave them funding as well as volunteers. So Al-Qaeda was working in Libya then with NATO cooperation in Syria. So, and this is amazing, because a little over a decade ago, it was Al-Qaeda that was behind the attacks in New York. Who would have thought a little over a decade ago that the United States would at some point be having some sort of cooperation, which is out in the open. You can use a search engine to find information about this.
Right.
And so the destruction, and this is, they like to say this is sectarian, this is Muslim against Muslim, Shia, Sunni, but in reality, if you look in Libya, there's no Iranian involvement, there are no Shias, it's a Sunni country, but NATO succeeded in destroying it by allowing extremists to have a foothold in that country. They did the same thing in Syria. For years, in the West, actually, they made documentaries about how Muslims were going to Syria to fight for freedom and so on. Now they're making documentaries demonizing those same Muslim youths that they were encouraging a couple of years ago to go. So I think, when Ayatollah Khamenei is, in the letter, when he was saying, look, don't look at Daesh as representative of Islam, you have to not only take a rethink and look at the Islamic text and see what Muslims think and how different it is from how they're represented, but also it's very important to look at the the more recent history, and also to take note of the fact that in previous decades, how Western countries, how they behaved in Vietnam, how they used the same extremism in Nicaragua. The Contra rebels, they carried out the same sort of atrocities as Daesh does right now against the Nicaraguans, because Nicaragua was a country that was opposed to American hegemony. So this is not something new or extraordinary. But again, it's in the Western media, for a long time, they were quiet about this extremism. Now that it's become such a huge monster, they're talking about it, but they don't tell us that it was it was these countries, these media outlets that were supporting them just a couple of years ago.
That's right, very ironic. Now, I know that we have our studio audience here, and I'm sure you guys have questions. I want to thank you for your patience. But before I get to you, let's first listen to a package that our correspondent from New York has prepared for us on this topic, and then we'll come right back, and then you can address your questions. Susan Medeiros now reports.
The leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei's letter asking Western youth not to judge Islam based on the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks went viral minutes after it was shared on his Twitter account, an official website. In the letter, Iran's leader asks a series of questions from its readers, like if they have directly read the Quran of the Muslims or have studied the teachings of the Prophet of Islam and his humane ethical doctrine, and possibly most importantly, whether they have ever received the message of Islam from any source other than the media.
Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't educated on Islam, and they get the sound bites from the press, and they have a hell of a slant against Islam, and they tie these two idiots into Islam.
Condemning terrorist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram, the leader ends his message on a hopeful note on how the future generations will write history if they have accurate information about global developments.
The message, the interaction should be between Islam and the Western world, and there should be more of an understanding. I think that's his hope.
Iran denounced the shooting at the offices of French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, but has also condemned as provocative its publication of a new cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. Many believe the letter comes at a critical time when Islamophobia is on the rise in many Western nations, but also when there is an unprecedented opportunity for diplomacy between the Muslim world and Western nations. Susan Medeiros, Press TV, New York.
Okay, that was Susan Medeiros. Let's have her on. She joins us right now from New York to tell us a little bit about this letter. Susan, your package there was great in terms of information relayed, but tell us how. Has this letter by Iran's leader been received? I'm sure you've been there out on the streets talking to the general public about it.
Yeah, you know, it was really interesting. We talk about the significance of the timing of the letter when it came during the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and also what we're seeing with ISIS or ISIL and different Takfiri groups. But also it came at a time when there's a national dialogue here in the United States about racial bias and racial profiling, from Ferguson to here in New York to Ohio and elsewhere, Florida as well. And, you know, there is this conversation going on about whether or not the black population, the brown population, is the other. And I think this letter sort of touched home with a lot of those demonstrators out on the streets, saying that, you know, yes, we do have that sort of international issue that we're dealing with, but we're also dealing with the issue of being discriminated here at home as well. So it was a critical time for that letter. Obviously, those demonstrations, those protests are going on as well, but it really did, you know, connect in a lot of ways with people who are struggling to find a voice here in the United States as well, not necessarily Muslims, but maybe African Americans or communities that are being marginalized, so to say.
But there's a point of view here. I mean, we're talking about New York City. I live there. You're there right now. And it's quite surprising to hear, based on, obviously, events taking place there in the States, that it has brought to surface the way that people look at each other in terms of, you name it, color, jobs, ethnicity. Why has that somewhat surfaced now? Is it just because of the events, or were they based on the history, that it was never talked about as much as it should have? What do you think?
Well, you know, it's really interesting, Kaveh. You've been to New York. You know how diversified this city is. You know, we always have jokingly say that you can't find anyone that speaks English in this city, or American English, so to say. But, you know, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, in a city as diverse as New York, why is it that there are so many different issues in terms of racial bias going on, considering the fact that it's a metropolitan city? One of the reasons is because of the class warfare that's going on right now. You know, you have gentrification on the one hand, you have high rents on the other. You really do have a feeling of even the middle class feeling as the other, so to say, and not maybe on the top echelon of the society. So I think that has a lot to do with it, and you really see these sort of you know, different incidents of not only shootings of African Americans or maybe, you know, racial bias towards them. You don't really only see that in communities that are necessarily of color, but of communities that are maybe less fortunate, that are struggling to get by, struggling to make ends meet, and these all come together. So when we talk about the other, we're really talking about what, you know, the quote-unquote American dream, the success is being portrayed as, and how so many people realistically, as Dr. Marandi said, you know, they're not really achieving that. So you become the other subconsciously.
Very well, Susan. Let's now go to London. Our audience has questions for our guests. Kevin Barrett, author and Islamic studies expert, and Abdul Ali Musa, director and imam at the Masjid of Washington. Both of them are with us. And London, I'm going to pass it on to you. We're going to get your image hopefully soon. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Marwan Ahmadzai. My question is regarding the impact of the letter, how influential the letter really is or was, and what was to whom this letter was directed, because we all know that generally it was directed to the youth in general in the West. But if you look at a little deeper than that, because there are, from my personal view, there are three different categories of youth in the West. There are the right-wing extremist groups like EDL, and there are like Muslim extremists who are a little, or I would say they're sympathizer of terrorists or groups like ISIS. And at the same time, there are some Muslim groups who are in the middle, who are not very actively engaged in politics, and they're not or students of politics. So, so to whom this letter was directed to, and how impact it really had on the Muslim on the youth in the West,
okay.
Because we didn't see much of the coverage of this letter on the Western media, and if ISIS, for example, would release a statement or a violent video, that would be much more attractive to the Western media compared to a very peaceful and non-violent letter from Mr. Khamenei.
Very well. Kevin Barrett, can you address that, please?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The media are biased towards spectacular imagery, and spectacular violence always grabs people's attention, whereas thoughtful discourse is much harder to transmit through television and television-type media. So I think that we have to see this as sort of a contest between this very extreme, bloody, and really content-free, shocking imagery, the Daesh videos and so on, designed to smear Islam, and this more thoughtful discourse, of which the Supreme Leader's letter is a very, very excellent example. And in the short term, of course, you're right. The spectacular, bloody imagery will get more attention. But in the long run, I think that the impact of this letter could gradually create a bit of a groundswell leading to young people looking at other aspects of Islam. In the letter, the Supreme Leader did say, you don't need to accept my reading of Islam. Please go out and look for yourself. And there are so many facets of the Islamic religion and Islamic culture that are just waiting to be rediscovered. Here in the United States, for example, Rumi, the great Persian poet, was the #1 best-selling poet for years. And yet, when people in America think of Islam, they don't think of Jalaluddin Rumi. they think of him as something different, some kind of, maybe some know he's a Sufi, but they don't even know that, Tasawwuf or Sufism is related to Islam. There's the Islamic tradition in philosophy. There are so many interesting angles. There's the fact that the Unitarian movement, which my family was involved in long ago, is actually theologically very close to Islam. And this is the heart of the American religion, according to the scholar Harold Bloom. This is the religion of Thoreau and Emerson, the leaders of the American literary renaissance in the 19th century. And then there's the history of African American Islam, which is so rich in expressive culture. So there's so many different, and I'm just scratching the surface. So all of these different elements of Islamic religion and tradition are out there waiting to be rediscovered. And yet the powers that be are putting up a filter, a veil in front of us, a kind of a screen, and projecting bloody images on that screen to prevent people from looking beyond that. And in the short run, unfortunately, that veil will remain up, and people undoubtedly will be transfixed by these horrific images being fed to them by the mainstream media. But in the long run, I do hope that just as Jalaluddin Rumi has managed to reach very large numbers of Western readers with this poetry from many centuries ago, the Supreme Leader's letter and other efforts that perhaps will build on it and continue to push for this dialogue will, in the long run, carry the day.
Very well. Finally, we're going to get to our studio audience. I do apologize for not getting to you earlier, but let's start with you and a question that you may have.
Yes, my name is Borna Danish. I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. I lived in Dallas, Texas for 27 years. I have a comment and a question for Imam Musa. First off, I just wanted to say that I've known Imam Musa for years, and there is absolutely nobody that follows Imam Khamenei in the United States, or probably in the whole world, the way that Imam Musa does, and I want to thank him for that. But my question for Imam Musa is that when I read Imam Khamenei's message, it reminded me of Imam Khomeini's message to Gorbachev. I wanted to see what if Imam Musa saw the same comparisons, or what he thought about the letter.
Very well. Imam Musa, question to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yes, Brother Borna, exactly that was our analysis. In 1989, Imam's a letter to Gorbachev. But there was another thing that you and I talk a lot about. When we were there in November, it was many discussions made. When it was over, we had a chance to visit the Rahbar, and he spoke to us. One thing that we know for sure, the Rahbar is clear, concise, and excellent in his analysis about the global situation. And we know he was correct about America because we're from America. But you and I both know that when the Rahbar makes statements and gives indications of what we should do, there's a gap, as he mentioned in his letter, that there needs to be a bridge that builds between the perception of Islam and the reality. We are here in America. We want to, and we work hard to try to build that bridge that transfers the mind and the spirit beyond the chasm that they have created for us. This goes back to what we call the ancient war between Haq and Batil. Batil is what we call state-sponsored terrorism. That means, as Brother Marandi had said, that means Saudi Arabia, Qatar, European powers, all collaborate to spend millions, actually billions of dollars, even in the U.S. Remember all the Wahhabi, Salafi books that we can get for free from Dar es Salaam Press in America and around the world. But do we have our own mechanism? This is what we've been striving for for decades. We are not willing to sit here and just analyze the problem. We want to build the mechanism and the infrastructure. We have the people, we have many students, and we have centers all around America now that claim to support the Rahbar. But we need some simple support to help us translate the Rahbar's analysis and his guidelines into work. This is the gap that we have, and we have had it for over a decade now. A gap between the direction that we receive from good guidance, right, and the follow-through. Now we call it, if they have state-sponsored batil, then we should have state-sponsored haq.
Very well. This gap, Dr. Marandi, I'm assuming one of the ways to have the message from the good, as Abdullah Musa said there, is through media. And we could also talk about print. I'm assuming that's one of the things that maybe we're not as strong in, perhaps, compared to the Western media, since they, in a sense, do have a stranglehold on the media. I noticed the guest in London said Muslim extremists. So that's, to me, a touch of Western media, because immediately equating Muslim with extremism is something that they're penetrating inside the minds of people. How can we fill in that gap? Is it the responsibility of the imams of the different masjids from different countries? They need to converge. We know that Tehran had this huge gathering of Muslim scholars from around the world to clarify, to educate. This was held just a couple of months back. What do you think? How can that gap be filled?
I think that's the most difficult question to answer of all, because as you rightly pointed out, and your guest pointed out, that it's an issue of language and how we are constructed, especially in the West. For example, going back to the letter to Gorbachev, I think one of the important things about that letter was that the late Imam Khomeini was saying that, until now you've been saying that all of the important ideas in the world come from the West. Whether it's Marxism, it's a European product, or capitalism, liberal capitalism, it's still a European product. And we've been hearing for centuries that in order for us to become civilized, we have to mimic the West. So we are not civilized, and in order to become civilized, we have to imitate. We have to make them. They basically, to a large degree, colonize our minds with these ideas, and and even in, some people in the way they walk and talk, and the way in which they dress, they mimic the West. And this is something that many thinkers have discussed in the past. But in this particular letter, I think that Imam Khomeini in that letter was basically saying that, look, we have something to offer. Your system has failed in the case of communism, but our system hasn't. On the other hand, I think this recent letter is significant in the sense that it also deals with the same question. And that it's talking about, it's not saying that it's not demonizing the West. In fact, in the letter, Ayatollah Khamenei actually speaks in praise of historians and Western thinkers who've critiqued many of the realities of the past and many of the problems that have been created as a result of policies promoted by important powers. But what he does also say is that, look, rethink your worldview. Look at us differently. And that actually is not only something that would be very courageous for a young person in the West to do, but also it's something very important for people in the non-Western world to do as well, to sort of rethink the world and not to simply look towards what is going on in the West, what the media in the West is saying, and try to think differently. Try to see, maybe this part, what he's saying is we have something to say. So listen to us, listen to our voices, and then come to a conclusion. If people in the West, if young people in the West are able to follow that line of thought, then I think that would have a significant impact on society. But the reality is that the Western media has a stranglehold over the public discourse, not only in the West but also in the rest of the world. We in Iran know much of the rest of the world through the Western media. The rest of the world knows us through Western media. So this is a major problem. And that is one reason which limits the impact of such letters. But this is something that people who are open-minded, people who are knowledgeable, they simply have to keep pushing until change is brought about. And one small point that I'd like to add about the notion of spectacle in the Western media, and for example how horrific images are constantly shown. This is one of the paradoxes, I think, of capitalism, in that on the one hand the media is in the hands of those who are close to power. To a large extent, the relationship between power as in government and power as in economy and corporations is quite clear. But also, because of the nature of capitalism, because they're constantly looking for more viewers, these sort of images are what increase their viewers. So in a sense, not only is capitalism a problem because it destroys democracy, because basically those who are powerful dictate the public discourse to the public, but on the other hand it intensifies hatred and hostility and phobia as a result of the images that are shown on television, which is itself linked to the notion of capitalism and increasing viewership and therefore increasing wealth and so on and so forth.
Indeed.
So it's a very complicated issue.
Well, they have an industry behind doing that too, which hopefully if we have some time we can get to it. But we're going to go to the studio in London. I can see all your faces looking at us. We're looking at you. Anybody who has a question, go ahead.
I'd like to say Assalamu alaikum and Bismillah, Bilal Ali Hu. My question is just backtracking a little bit to what was mentioned in the studio just now. We're talking about mass communication. I'm injecting that word into the conversation. And it seems that there is if you would say, a clash of ideas that's taking place in the world right now. And it's a clash that always takes place in the world. And you use the term, I heard a term used by the doctor that there is a stranglehold on the media by the Western forces. But I would beg to differ and suggest that there are new and emerging Muslim media, mass media organizations. But what the problem seems to be is that the organizations that are, let's say, use that term Western, that they seem to be resourced and funded. But I don't think Muslims have caught up to speed about the importance of investing into the media. So that's the opportunity seems to be there, even if it was to invest in social media. But the actual, for want of a better term, the economic investment isn't made. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'd like to go to Kevin Barrett on that. But Kevin Barrett, I'd like to ask you, Press TV itself, when it first started out, Voice of the Voiceless, and we know how Press TV was suppressed because it was telling the truth. We can go into history of how that happened. So what is the solution here? When the voice of the voiceless, in case of Press TV or other media organizations, come to light, in this case we're talking about Islam and the right message, do you think that if it's strong enough that it's going to be suppressed by the larger media conglomerates?
Well, that's right. There's always a fine balancing line between telling the truth flat out, which is what I try to do, and pretty much what Press TV does as well, and then trying to tailor the message to make it acceptable enough so you don't get banned from all the satellites, which is the case with RT, another relatively truthful outlet. I think that Muslims do need to get more involved in creating good, positive media. There's a huge opportunity here. The Western corporate-dominated media, which has a heavy Zionist presence, is dedicated purely to the bottom line and making a profit, and also to a very slight extent to pursuing their own imperial and Zionist interests as well. But there are a lot of ordinary people in the world who don't identify with the sex, the violence, the wild, extreme kinds of images that are getting worse and worse. I've seen them getting worse for the past 40, 50 years of my lifetime. And there are some people like Merlin Miller here in the United States who's worked with Iran to some extent. We're trying to create more wholesome media. In his case, he's making Hollywood-style movies, but without the sex, violence, and degrading themes. And I think that Muslims should work much, much harder at this. You know, we trying to preserve a traditional culture that puts a heavy emphasis on values and morals and reasonable, balanced behavior and outlooks and spirituality. reality as well. And there's so little of this in the media today. So I hope that given the decentralization of media that has followed the rise of the internet and the satellite chains and so on, we will see Muslims taking a more active role in trying to convey the message of real Islam, as the Supreme Leader's letter did, because we're fighting an uphill battle right now against a tidal wave of propaganda from the corporate mainstream, but we do have the technology now to create alternatives, and I think there is a hunger out there for those alternatives.
Very well. Thank you very much for that. We have a question from our panel here, our studio guest. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Taras Chernenko from Russia. So I have led the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran called the European youth, I quote, to receive knowledge of Islam from its primary and regional sources, gain information about Islam through the Quran and the life of its great prophet, unquote. So, all right, but the problem is that actually there's no group, there's no extremist group in the world that would claim the rejection of those primary sources. It's not a problem of rejecting the primary sources, but problem of misinterpretation. And so my question is, to your mind, what do you think, Dr. Marandi? What is the most effective way of representing the true interpretation of Quran and Sunnah? And more, how do we provide everyone interested in Islamic studies with the effective criteria allowing to make a difference between the two, between the authentic interpretation of Islam and its primary sources and non-authentic false interpretation given by the extremist groups such as ISIL, other Takfir groups, etc.? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the very fact that he actually says that look to the the Prophet and the Quran, he's already pointing out that as a result of this sentence itself, he's basically pointing out that we reject this ideology, and therefore by extension, he is already telling a Western audience that this is not what mainstream Islam believes in. You raise a very important point about how do we go from there. And for example, if a Western audience wants to be introduced to what is, let's say, authentic Islam or real Islam, how is that done? And I think that is a major problem because, again, because the wealth is, there is this stranglehold. Of course, it's relative because your guest was the member of the audience in London was right. There is a lot of good material out there online on some alternative media outlets. But the reality is most of the media, whether Western media or media funded by these oil-rich dictatorships who basically support Wahhabism and extremist ideologies basically for their own self-interest. Their rulers are not really religious people. These are families that they run the countries as a family business. So this is a major problem. But I would like to actually move a bit away from this. And I would
We've got
like
2 minutes, I'm sorry to say that.
Okay, very briefly. And that is that I'd like to actually say that we shouldn't look at this simply as Islam. I think that the whole of the world, the non-Western world, and much of the Western world, which is now facing poverty, the lower classes, those who are abused, those who are ignored, those who are otherized, and the non-Western world, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa, whether it's this part of the world, whether it's Asia, they have a common heritage, and that is colonialism, and that is hegemony and oppression. And therefore, there's a lot of common understanding already there. For example, when the Israelis were attacking Gaza, the most sympathetic part of the world was Latin America. So I think this, it is sort of, there's a host of different communities, Muslim and non-Muslim, that have a lot in common, and we have to find ways in order for them to interconnect and to bring about better future.
Just when we get started, we have to end this. I do apologize for that, but thank you very much. Well, this was very enlightening. I hope it was for everyone here. I'd like to thank our youths inside the studio here in Tehran. I'd like to thank Dr. Marandi, professor at the University of Tehran, and also our guest, Kevin Barrett, author and Islamic studies expert, who was speaking to us. Abdul Ali Musa, thank you so much, director and Imam at the Masjid of Washington, and also our correspondent, Susan Modaris, who joined us from New York. You were just tuned into an edition of 1 hour edition of Seeking the Truth. If you can find out more about this, do log on to our website. Plenty of information there on at allthews.presstv.com. From me, Kaveh Tawi, and the entire team here in the studios, it's bye-bye.